Welcome to Introduction to Logic with Dr. Cecilea Mun. Today's topic is arguments. What are they? And what are they made of? You might think that an argument is what happens when two people fight. This is what one might mean by an argument in everyday, ordinary language. Thinking this is not entirely wrong, since people often make arguments when they fight with other people, but sometimes fights are simply about insulting or criticizing people, and not about convincing someone of anything based on reasons. An insult or a criticism by itself is not an argument. But we're not talking about what an argument is according to ordinary, everyday language. We're talking about arguments according to logic. Logic is the science of arguments. So, we want to know what an argument is according to the science of arguments. According to the science of arguments, an argument is a set of at least two statements, wherein at least one of the statements is put forth as the main point of the argument, and at least one statement is put forth as the reason for the main point. One thing that is important to note with this definition is that in talking about the kind of statements that make up an argument, the definition notes that at least one statement is put forth as the main point and that at least one statement is put forth as the reason. This talk of statements as being put forth as something has to do with the intention behind the use of an argument. The intention behind the use of an argument is to convince others that the main point of the argument is true. The intention behind the use of an argument explains what someone is trying to do or accomplish with the use of an argument. They are trying to convince someone that some statement is true. The intention behind the use of an argument is one thing that makes arguments different from non-arguments. We'll talk more about this later on. For now, just keep in mind that an argument is something that people use to try to convince others that some statement is true. Now, as we discussed, according to logic, which is the science of arguments, an argument is a set of at least two statements, wherein at least one of the statements is put forth as the main point of the argument, and at least one statement is put forth as the reason for the main point. For something to be an argument, then, it must have three basic features. First, it must have at least two statements. Second, at least one of the statements must be the main point. And third, the other statements must be the reasons. In logic, the main point of an argument is also called the conclusion of that argument, and the reasons are called the premises of that argument. So, the three basic features that make up an argument, according to logic, are at least two statements, at least one conclusion, and at least one premise. Now, before we continue on to talk about some examples of arguments and non-arguments, I have a question. As we discussed, in logic, an argument is something that has at least two statements, at least one conclusion, and at least one premise. If that's the case, are the conclusions and the premises of an argument also statements? The answer is yes. Conclusions and premises are kinds of statements, and the kind of statement they are is determined by their function in an argument. A conclusion is the kind of statement that functions as the main point of an argument, and a premise is the kind of statement that functions as a reason in support of the main point in an argument. So, an argument is made up of a conclusion and at least one premise, and both the premise and the conclusion are statements. The premise functions in the argument to support the conclusion as a reason for the conclusion, and the conclusion functions in the argument as the main point of the argument. Here is an example of an argument. This argument states that if Socrates was human, then he was mortal. So, since Socrates was human, Socrates was mortal. Since this is an argument, it should have the three basic features we discussed. First, it must have at least two statements. Second, at least one of the statements must be the main point. And third, the other statements must be the reasons. Question: how many statements does this argument have, and can you identify the conclusion and all the premises? To answer this question, follow the instructions given in the next slide. Pause this video on the next slide where the argument is presented, and write down the argument. Then unpause the video and I will walk you through the rest of the instructions. Next, identify the number of statements by doing the following. First, Place an open bracket at the beginning and a closed bracket at the end of each statement. Then, number each statement in the order they occur before the open bracket for each statement. Below is an example of how to do so. Pause this video now and follow the instructions given with the argument you wrote down. Then, unpause this video when you are done. Now, identify the statement that is the conclusion, i.e., the main point, by placing a C in front of the number for the statement that you believe is the conclusion of the argument. An example of how to do so is below, but don't just do what the example did, because statement 1 is not the conclusion of the argument we are currently working with. You need to think for yourself about which of the statements you identified is the conclusion, in other words, the main point of the argument. Ask yourself, which statement would someone be trying to convince you is true when they give you the argument you wrote down? Pause the video now, and then resume when you are ready for the next step. Now, identify all the statements that are premises, i.e., reasons that are intended to support the conclusion, by placing a P in front of the number for each of the statements that you believe is a premise of the argument. An example of how to do so is below, but don't just do what the example did. You need to think for yourself about which of the statements you identified are premises, in other words, are reasons that are intended to support the conclusion of the argument. Ask yourself which of the statements in the argument are being given as the reasons for the conclusion of the argument. Pause the video now, and then resume when you are ready for the next step. Here, again, is our example of an argument that we are currently working with. This argument has a total of 3 statements, as indicated by our statement numbers and our statement brackets. The first statement is, if Socrates was human, then he was mortal. The second statement is, Socrates was human. The third statement is, Socrates was mortal. Pause this video now to correct your answers if necessary, and make sure you use a pen or pencil that will help you differentiate your original answers from your corrections so you can easily recall what you learned when you review your notes. Resume the video when you are ready for the next answer. The conclusion of this argument is statement 3, as indicated by the C that was placed in front of the number for statement 3. In other words, statement 3, that Socrates was mortal, is the statement that someone would be trying to convince you is true when they use this argument with you. Pause this video here to make any necessary corrections to your answer, and resume when you are ready for the next answer. This argument has 2 premises, as indicated by the P placed in front of the number for statement 1 and statement 2. In other words, both statements 1, that if Socrates was human, then he was mortal, and statement 2, that Socrates was human, are the statements that someone would be giving you as the reasons for you to believe that the conclusion, statement 3, that Socrates was mortal, is true when they use this argument with you. Pause this video here to make any necessary corrections to your answer, and resume when you are ready to continue. Now, before we continue on, I want to talk about how you can make sense of any wrong answers you might have to help you to continue to improve. When you compare your answer to this one, you might notice the following. You didn't have all your brackets in the right place. Your numbers are not in the same order. You did not place a P or a C in front of the right number. If you made any of these mistakes, don't worry. You're learning, and making mistakes is all part of the learning process. What's important is that you learn from your mistakes. So, what do your mistakes tell you? And how can we help you not make these same mistakes in the future? First, if you didn't have all your brackets in the right place, what this means is that you need to learn a bit more about what statements are. We'll talk more about what statements are toward the end of this lesson, but you'll also have additional lessons that will focus specifically on what statements are and how to identify them. So, just give yourself a bit more time to fill in some of your gaps in knowledge. By the end of this course, you should be an expert on what statements are and how to identify them. That is, as long as you also make sure to practice, check your answers, and learn from your mistakes. Second, if your numbers are not in the same order, then you most likely simply forgot to number the statements in the order that you read them. Not a big deal. This should be pretty simple to correct. In the future, just remember, number in the order you read each statement, and that's all. So, when you come across the first statement you read, give that the number 1. Then, the next statement that you read will get a number 2. And the statement after that will get a number 3, and so on. Third, you might not have placed a P or C in front of the right number. That's okay. What this most likely means is that you need to learn a bit more about how to identify premises and conclusions. Luckily, people often use words to indicate whether they are using some statement as a premise or a conclusion. You will learn about these premise and conclusion indicators in an upcoming lesson. For now, just keep in mind what your mistakes tell you about what you should do for the future, including what future lessons you should especially pay attention to, so you can continue to build your knowledge and fill in any gaps you might have. Now, recall our argument example and how we bracketed each statement, numbered them, and identified all the premises and the conclusion. Here are the statements again, but this time we have just the statements and nothing that is not a part of a statement. The premises are presented in the order of their numbered statements, one above the other. And the conclusion is placed at the bottom with a line separating the premises from the conclusion. We do this to help us visually represent the way in which this argument is structured. What the line tells us is that all the premises above the line are intended to support the conclusion. As a recap, we can tell that our example is an argument because it has the 3 basic features that all arguments have. It has at least 2 statements. In this example, there are a total of 3 statements. It has at least 1 premise. In this case, we have a total of 2 premises. And it has a conclusion. This brings our lesson to an end. In summary, logic is the science of arguments. An argument is a set of at least 2 statements wherein one of the statements is put forth as the main point of the argument and at least one statement is put forth as the reason for the main point. The intention behind the use of an argument is to convince others that the main point of the argument is true. The main point of an argument is the conclusion, and a reason given in support of the conclusion is a premise. The 3 basic features of an argument is that it has at least 2 statements, at least one statement is a conclusion, and at least one statement is a premise. Thank you for your attention and
Hi, I'm Kung Fu Logic Kitty, and I'm here just to remind you to don't forget to practice. Bye now.